Let me tell you about Silas Blackwood. He wasn't a man given to grand gestures or loud pronouncements. His world was circumscribed by the split-rail fences that bordered his property, fences his own father had put in, with posts hewn from locust trees, felled on the same land. Silas was a watcher, a trait he'd inherited from a long line of Blackwoods who had farmed that very soil since before the railroad ever thought to scar the valley with its iron tracks. He was in his late 70s, his face a roadmap of long summers and hard winters, his hands gnarled but steady. He'd seen seasons change, crops fail and flourish, and the world beyond his fence line accelerate into a blur of noise and hurry. But on his land, time moved at the pace of a turning plow, a rhythm he understood and trusted. The story of the fence began not with a bang, but with the crisp rustle of an envelope pushed through the mail slot of his old farmhouse door. It was a Tuesday morning in the late May of a year not so long ago, a morning that smelled of damp earth and blooming lilacs. The letter was from the Atlantic and Northern Rail Company, a corporate behemoth that had swallowed up the smaller local lines decades ago. The paper was thick, creamy, and expensive, bearing a letterhead of a stark modern locomotive that looked more like a spaceship than a train. The language within was just as cold and alien. It was a formal notice of encroachment. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that a significant portion of his fence, the very one that ran parallel to the tracks for nearly half a mile, was illegally situated on the railroad's right-of-way. The letter cited digital survey data, satellite imagery, and county records updated as recently as the previous quarter. It informed him that he had 30 days to remove the offending structure at his own expense. Failure to comply would result in its forced removal by the company, the cost of which would be billed to him, along with potential legal fees and fines. Silas read the letter twice, his brow furrowed, not in anger, but in a kind of weary contemplation. He folded it neatly, creasing it with a thumbnail that was as tough as horn, and placed it on the mantelpiece beneath a faded photograph of his father, standing in front of the very same fence, a proud, tired smile on his face. He had heard whispers of this before, of the new railroad management flexing its muscles, using its vast resources to redraw old lines and reclaim inches of land that had been peacefully cohabited for a century. They were a new breed, these men in sharp suits who managed assets from climate-controlled offices hundreds of miles away. They didn't understand the valley. They didn't understand the unwritten treaties and handshake agreements that had kept the peace between farmer and railroad for generations. They understood only data points on a screen, lines on a digital map that could be manipulated with the click of a mouse. To them, his fence wasn't a legacy. It was an anomaly, an error in the system that needed to be corrected. The fence was more than just wood and wire to Silas. It was a tangible piece of his history. He could walk its length and point out the post his father had set the day he was born, the section his grandfather had repaired after the Great Flood of '36, the gate he himself had hung when he brought his own wife home to the farm for the first time. Each weathered post told a story. It stood as a silent testament to the Blackwood family's tenacity, a quiet declaration that this land was theirs, cared for and protected. The railroad had always been a neighbor, sometimes a noisy and disruptive one, but a neighbor nonetheless. He remembered as a boy waving to the engineers in their steam-belching behemoths, the friendly toot of the whistle in return. He remembered the slow, rumbling freight trains that were a part of the valley's heartbeat. Now, that neighbor was sending a threat, a sterile corporate demand that sought to erase a piece of his family's soul. Let me tell you about Richard Sterling. He was the regional manager of property and assets for the Atlantic and Northern. He was in his early 40s, sharp, ambitious, and a firm believer in the cleansing power of modernization. He had earned his position by being ruthlessly efficient, by trimming fat and maximizing profit. His latest project was the Right-of-Way Reclamation Initiative, a corporate-speak term for squeezing every last inch of legally owned land out of the company's vast portfolio. He saw the world through the lens of a spreadsheet. Old farms with their crooked fences and unwritten understandings were, to him, inefficiencies. They were loose ends that needed to be tied up, rounded off, and made to conform to the clean, precise lines of his digital surveys. He drove a late-model German sedan that hummed with quiet power, and he carried a tablet that contained more mapping data than the Library of Congress. He believed in his technology implicitly. It was objective. It was infallible. A GPS coordinate was a hard fact, not a sentimental story about a grandfather's fence post. When Silas Blackwood failed to respond to the initial letter and then to a second, more sternly worded certified letter, Sterling decided it was time for a personal visit. He considered it a necessary, if slightly distasteful, part of his job. He would be firm, professional, and explain the situation in terms the old man could not possibly refute. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The sun was high and hot, and the air was thick with the drone of insects. His polished black shoes were immediately coated in a fine layer of dust as he stepped out of his air-conditioned car. He saw Silas on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair, watching his approach with an unnervingly calm expression. Sterling strode up the walkway, his briefcase a stark leather and steel rectangle in this world of weathered wood and overgrown greenery. He introduced himself with a crisp, confident tone, extending a hand that Silas looked at for a moment before slowly, deliberately shaking it. Sterling's grip was firm and quick. Silas's was dry and powerful, a grip that had held on to plows and fence pullers for a lifetime. Sterling began his presentation. He was polite, even a little patronizing, as one might be when explaining a complex matter to a child. He pulled out his tablet and with a few swift taps, brought up a high-resolution satellite image of the farm. A bright red line, thick and uncompromising, sliced across the image. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "As you can see from our most recent satellite survey, this red line indicates the legal boundary of the Atlantic and Northern right-of-way. And this yellow line," he said, tracing another line with his finger, "represents the current placement of your fence. As is clearly visible, the fence encroaches on our property by a margin of approximately 8 feet along this entire western edge." Silas just rocked, the gentle creak of the old chair the only sound for a long moment. He didn't even glance at the tablet. He looked past Sterling, toward the shimmering steel rails in the distance. "That fence," Silas said, his voice a low rumble, "has stood in that spot for 87 years. My father built it with my grandfather. The railroad men back then knew where the line was. They had no problem with it." Sterling managed a tight, professional smile. "I understand, sir, and I respect the history. But times change. We have more accurate tools now. Sentimental value, unfortunately, doesn't hold up against geodetic survey data. The law is quite clear on this. This is our property, and your fence is on it." He then launched into a detailed explanation of the legalities, citing easements, property law, and the federal charters that granted the railroad its authority. He spoke of liability, of insurance requirements, of the need for an unobstructed maintenance corridor. It was a well-rehearsed speech designed to overwhelm and intimidate. He had given it dozens of times to other farmers and landowners up and down the line. Most of them, faced with the threat of the company's legal department, had grumbled and complied. They didn't have the resources or the will to fight a multi-billion-dollar corporation. But Silas wasn't most people. He just sat there, watching, listening. He let Sterling finish his entire spiel, let the man's words hang in the hot, still air. When it was clear the manager had nothing more to say, Silas stopped rocking. He leaned forward slightly, his pale blue eyes pinning Sterling in place. "You're wrong," he said. "It wasn't an argument. It was a statement of fact." Sterling's professional veneer cracked just a little. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Mr. Blackwood, with all due respect, you are not a surveyor. You are not a lawyer. We are. Our data is precise. It's science. What are you basing your claim on? Memory? Family stories?" The condescension was thick in his voice now. The time for politeness was over. This was the point where he applied pressure. "Let me be perfectly clear. If the fence is not moved within the next 14 days, I will have no choice but to dispatch a crew to remove it. You will be billed for their time, and we will pursue further action to recover all associated costs. It's your choice. You can move it yourself, or you can pay us to do it. But either way, the fence is moving." He snapped his tablet off and slid it back into his briefcase, a gesture of finality. He expected acquiescence. He expected a defeated sigh. He did not expect what happened next. Silas slowly stood up. He was taller than Sterling had realized, his frame stooped by age, but still broad. He looked at the shiny car, at the expensive suit, at the man who had come to his home to threaten him with science and law. "You think your new tools tell you the truth," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "You think because something is on a screen, it's real. Your machines are new. Your company is new. But this land is old, and the truth of it is older still. You want to see the truth, Mr. Sterling? You want to see the document that says you and your satellites are wrong? Come back tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Bring your best surveyor, bring your fanciest equipment, but be prepared to be educated." There was no anger in his voice, only a profound and unshakable certainty. It was this certainty more than anything that unsettled Sterling. It wasn't the bluster of an ignorant old man. It was the calm of someone who held a winning hand and was simply waiting for the right moment to play it. Sterling, feeling his authority challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated, found himself agreeing. It was absurd, a waste of time, but his pride was now on the line. "Fine, Mr. Blackwood, 10 o'clock. We'll be here, and we will settle this once and for all." He turned and walked back to his car, the dust clinging to his trousers, feeling strangely as if he had just lost a battle he thought he had already won. The next morning, Sterling returned, and he wasn't alone. He brought with him a two-man survey crew and a junior associate, a young man named Ben who looked nervous and out of place. The surveyors immediately began setting up their equipment. A total station with its laser rangefinder, GPS tripods, and data collectors. It was a display of technological force meant to be intimidating. They were triangulating with satellites, cross-referencing with digital county plats, creating a three-dimensional model of the disputed boundary line with millimeter accuracy. Sterling stood with his arms crossed, watching the process with a smug satisfaction. Silas came out onto the porch with 2 glasses of lemonade and offered one to the junior associate, Ben, who took it with a grateful murmur. Silas ignored Sterling and the surveyors completely. He just sat and waited. After about an hour of measurements and calculations, the lead surveyor, a man with a deeply tanned face and an air of professional boredom, confirmed Sterling's initial assessment. "The line is where we said it is, Mr. Sterling," the surveyor announced, loud enough for Silas to hear. "The fence is 8 feet, 3 inches onto railroad property at the north end, and 7 feet, 10 inches at the south end. It's a clear encroachment. The data is unequivocal." Sterling turned to Silas, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. "There you have it, Mr. Blackwood. The science speaks for itself. Are you satisfied now? Will you be moving the fence?" Silas took a slow sip of his lemonade. He set the glass down carefully on the porch railing, the condensation making a dark ring on the weathered wood. "Now it's my turn," he said, and he pushed himself to his feet. He didn't invite them to follow. He just started walking toward the old barn that stood behind the farmhouse. Its red paint faded to a soft, dusty rose. Curiosity piqued, Sterling, Ben, and the 2 surveyors followed. The interior of the barn was cool and dark, smelling of hay, old leather, and engine oil. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the siding in dusty golden shafts. Silas walked over to a heavy wooden workbench that was cluttered with tools from 3 generations. Against the back wall was a tall metal cabinet secured with a heavy, old-fashioned padlock. Silas produced a key from his pocket, a key of ornate black and brass, and unlocked it. Inside, on a shelf by itself, lay a long cylindrical tube made of what looked like waxed cardboard, capped at both ends with tarnished brass lids. It looked like an artillery shell casing from a forgotten war. Silas handled it with a reverence that silenced the small group. He carried it back out into the sunlight and over to a large, flat-topped tree stump that had served as an outdoor workbench for decades. "Ben," Silas said, addressing the young associate directly, "give me a hand here." He handed the tube to the young man while he carefully brushed the dust and wood shavings from the top of the stump. "Let me tell you about the map. It wasn't just a map. It was a covenant, a piece of captured history. Silas's grandfather, a man who had trusted neither banks nor politicians, had commissioned it in the spring of 1931. There had been a dispute then, too, with the old Penn, Ohio rail line over water rights from a creek that ran through the property. To settle it for all time, his grandfather had hired a man named Jebediah Kane. Kane was a legend in the valley, a surveyor of unimpeachable integrity who still used the old ways. Gunter's chains, brass transits, and celestial navigation. He didn't trust the newfangled calculating machines. He trusted his own meticulous trigonometry, recorded in a leather-bound logbook. Kane and his team had spent a month on the Blackwood property, walking every inch of it. They drove galvanized iron pins, 2 feet long and an inch thick, at every major boundary corner, burying them deep enough that a plow would never touch them. And when they were done, Jebediah Kane had drafted a survey map. He drew it by hand on heavy, oil-impregnated linen, using waterproof India ink. Every line was perfect, every notation a work of calligraphic art. It showed not just the boundary lines, but the location of every significant tree, every rock outcropping, the precise course of the creek, and, most importantly, the exact negotiated boundary of the railroad's right-of-way. Signed and sealed not only by Jebediah Kane, but by the railroad's own chief engineer at the time, a man named Bartholomew Corbin. It was a legal document, a primary source, a piece of evidence that had slept in its dark tube for over 90 years, waiting. Silas carefully unscrewed one of the brass caps and slid the rolled document from its tube. The linen was heavy and cool to the touch. With Ben's help, he unrolled it across the top of the stump, using 4 smooth river stones from his pocket to weigh down the corners. The surveyors and Sterling crowded around. What they saw took their breath away. It was a work of art. The ink was still a crisp, dark black. The lines were sharp and precise. The lettering was elegant. In the bottom right corner was Kane's elaborate seal, embossed into the linen itself, and next to it, the flourishing signatures of Kane and the railroad's engineer, dated April 17th, 1931. Sterling scoffed, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "This is a lovely antique, Mr. Blackwood, but it's meaningless. It's from 1931. Records get updated, lines get redefined." "Do they?" Silas interrupted, his voice cutting through Sterling's dismissal. He pointed a gnarled finger at a specific point on the map, a point on the boundary line between his farm and the railroad. The notation read, "Iron Pin Survey Monument Number 4, set April 16th, 1931, 3.5 feet west of Triple Trunk Oak." Silas looked up, his eyes scanning the tree line along the fence. "That old oak came down in a storm 20 years ago," he said, "but the stump is still there." He started walking toward the fence, not looking back to see if they were following. They were. He led them to a spot about halfway down the fence line. There, nearly hidden by overgrown honeysuckle, was the massive, decaying stump of an ancient oak tree. Even as a stump, it was clear it had once had 3 distinct trunks. "All right, surveyor," Silas said, looking at the lead surveyor. "Your machine is so smart. Tell it to look for a 2-foot-long piece of galvanized iron buried about a foot deep. Right about here." He pointed to a spot a few feet away from the stump. The lead surveyor exchanged a skeptical look with his partner, but he was a professional. He grabbed a magnetic locator from his truck, a device designed to find buried metal survey markers. He switched it on and it began to emit a low, steady hum. He swept it over the area Silas had indicated. The hum remained steady. Nothing. Sterling crossed his arms, a smug look returning to his face. "As I said, an interesting piece of history, but—" The surveyor, however, wasn't giving up. He kicked at a small hummock of earth, clearing away some of the grass and roots. He swept the locator over the spot again. This time, the hum jumped in pitch, becoming a high-pitched whine. "Got something," the surveyor said, his voice suddenly alert. He grabbed a shovel from his truck and began to dig. The earth was soft and loamy. He dug down a few inches, then a foot. The shovel struck something with a solid metallic clang that echoed in the sudden silence. Everyone leaned in. The surveyor scraped away the last of the dirt. There it was, the top of a thick iron pin, its surface pitted and rusted, but unmistakably a survey monument. There was a long, profound silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets. The lead surveyor looked from the pin in the ground to the notation on the 90-year-old map to his own GPS equipment glittering uselessly in the sun. He pulled out a high-tech measuring device and took a reading from the pin to the fence. He did it 3 times. He finally looked up at Sterling, his face a mixture of disbelief and professional embarrassment. "He's right," the surveyor said, his voice flat. "The pin is exactly where the old map says it is, and according to this marker, the fence is 2 feet inside his property line. The railroad's right-of-way is 8 feet narrower than our records show." "Sir, our records are wrong." The words hung in the air, seeming to suck all the energy out of the hot afternoon. Richard Sterling stood there, his mouth slightly agape. His entire case, his entire platform of technological certainty had been dismantled by a piece of iron buried in the ground for nearly a century in a hand-drawn map. He looked at the pin, at the fence, at the old man who was now calmly rolling up his precious document. He had been so sure, so arrogant. The silence stretched. The junior associate, Ben, was staring at Silas with an expression of pure awe. Sterling's face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, denial, anger, and finally a grudging, deep-seated respect. He had been beaten, not by lawyers, not by a rival corporation, but by history itself. He walked over to Silas, who was carefully sliding the map back into its protective tube. "Mr. Blackwood," Sterling said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its earlier arrogance. I apologize. We were wrong." Silas screwed the brass cap back on the tube. He looked at Sterling, and there was no triumph in his eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet sadness. "The problem with your screens and your satellites, son," he said, his voice gentle, "is that you forget to look at the ground under your feet. You trust the copy, and you forget the original. Somewhere, a long time ago, somebody made a mistake typing a number into a computer. Maybe it was in the 70s when they first digitized the records. Maybe it was last year. A man made a mistake, and the machine believed him. And every machine after that believed the machine before it. You've been working off a ghost, a bad copy. This," he said, patting the cardboard tube, "this is the original. This is the truth." Sterling simply nodded, unable to form a reply. He was a man who dealt in facts and figures, and the facts had just irrevocably shifted. He instructed his crew to pack up their equipment. The lead surveyor, as he walked past Silas, tipped his hard hat in a gesture of respect. "That's a hell of a map, sir," he said. "They don't make them like that anymore." "No," Silas replied. "They sure don't." Richard Sterling and his team left. His expensive sedan crunched down the gravel driveway and disappeared, leaving only a cloud of dust that slowly settled back onto the quiet lane. The story, of course, did not end there. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived from the Atlantic and Northern Rail Company. This one was different. It was a personal letter from Richard Sterling. It contained a formal, written apology on behalf of the company for the error and the distress it had caused. It stated that their official records had been permanently corrected to reflect the boundary established by the 1931 survey. Tucked inside the letter was a second document, a new official plat map, digitally rendered but showing the correct boundary line, precisely matching the one Jebediah Kane had drawn by hand all those years ago. It was filed with the county and officially nullified the old incorrect record. The ghost had been exorcised. The truth was now the official record, but the story became something of a legend in the valley. It was told in the feed store, at the counter of the local diner, and on the porches of neighboring farms. It was the story of how Silas Blackwood, with nothing but an old piece of paper and a rusty iron pin, had faced down the mighty railroad and won. It was a tale of quiet defiance, of the enduring power of history against the arrogant march of modernity. It reinforced a belief that the people in the valley held dear, that the old ways, the things that were built to last, held a wisdom that the new, disposable world had forgotten. Richard Sterling was changed by the encounter. He became a more cautious man, a more humble manager. He learned that data was only as good as its source, and that the oldest source was often the most reliable. He was heard on more than one occasion telling new hires the story of the old farmer and the 1931 map, using it as a cautionary tale against hubris and an over-reliance on technology. He taught them to respect the ground truth, to look for the iron pins, to seek out the primary documents before sending threatening letters. He learned, in short, the lesson Silas had taught him. The fence never moved. It still stands today, its locust posts silvered with age, a quiet monument not just to the Blackwood family, but to a truth that was buried, forgotten, and then brought back into the light. And a few years ago, the story had its final echo. Silas was gone by then. The farm passed down to his son, who ran it with the same quiet dedication. A young woman from the rail company, an environmental engineer, came by the farm. She was there to plan the laying of a new fiber optic cable along the right-of-way. She knocked on the farmhouse door, and when Silas's son answered, she smiled politely. "Sir," she said, "my name is Sarah." Before we do anything, before we even bring out our survey equipment, my boss, Mr. Sterling, asked me to come here first. He said that if we wanted to know exactly where the real property line is, we should respectfully ask if we could see your family's map. Silas's son smiled, a slow, knowing smile. He went to the old metal cabinet in the barn, the brass key feeling familiar in his hand. The engineers laughed when the company first sent its letters, but the old map answered, and the boundary was settled. That's what happens when you underestimate a truth that was written in waterproof ink and anchored to the earth with iron.